Hey Samuel, how you doing? Okay, so I was reading your writing here, and I got to admit I'm a little confused. I'm not exactly sure what you're referring to when you say I went with the spacing of the n. Where did you go with the spacing of the n? I'm not exactly sure what you're referring to. So if you could clarify that, I would. You are correct in saying that is it's an n space, but I'm not exactly sure where you're referring to that using the n as your spacing. So maybe you could clarify that for me. Overall, I think you've done a good job. I think that your letter forms are coming along quite nicely. I'd like to see a little darker of a fill here so we can see more contrast, so we can see these optical relationships a little more readily than this. And the suggestion there would be to use a softer lead to get greater contrast and make the fill a little bit darker. I think your letter forms are pretty done pretty well. A couple of areas of inconsistency. The N right here, this serif on the N, as we can see right now, you got a curve. This kind of curves up right there. There's no curve. There's a very slight curve, but that curves up to a point right there, and we just don't see that in the end. So you'll want to address that. Also, if you take a look at the teardrop serif for the lowercase a, yours is a little bit hanging over a little bit from where where that bowl of the lowercase a is right there, but you can see that that's almost perfectly parallel right there. So that overhang right there is something that you'll want to adjust as well. So, just basic relationships. I think craft is generally pretty good. So as I said, the only thing I'd like to see is just the addition of some contrast by using a darker fill in the letter space, in the fill of the letter forms themselves. The word fire is kerned pretty well. I think the one thing I would like to see is, I'd like to see the I a little closer to the F. Okay, this space here is good, this space here is good. And is kerned beautifully. Just really beautifully. If anything, we can close that just a touch right there. Close that down just a little bit. Don't be afraid to bring that serif closer, the serif from the A, a little bit closer to the serif from the N. That's no problem at all. You can even have these serifs touched. That's not a problem because at this type size, anything above display type, you're okay with your serifs touching, creating ligatures. Anything below that, you'll want to adjust your tracking, because if your serifs are touching in body copy, it's going to impede reading a little bit. So if your serifs are touching in body copy, you want to open up the tracking. If they're touching in display type, anything above 12 to 14 point, you're okay as long as the space doesn't look like it's too tight. Let me show you an example right here. Okay, this right here is too tight. You see what I'm saying? And then you can see it right here and here. Okay, sorry, Dakota, I'm using yours as an example. But, okay, so generally, I think your word spacing your letter spacing is very good. The word spacing, on the other hand, is really, really wide. And what does that do, Samuel? That wide word spacing, what does that do? And you should be answering that question. It's not rhetorical. So think about it. What does it do when there's a wide space between these words? And if you're thinking to yourself, it creates a pause, you're exactly right. And it does. It creates a pause. And the mind has no choice but to pause when there's spaces between letters. So basically, the mind is perceiving this as fire and ice, as opposed to fire and ice. Let me show you another example. And Dakota, I'm going to use your example here as well. Now, notice Dakota has a wide space between fire and a narrow space between and ice. So what does that do? That creates this, fire and ice. Okay? But what you want is for the mind to read this as fire and ice. So right now we're seeing fire and ice, and that's because of these enormous word spaces. So let's close those down to what you think would be more normal of word spaces. And I don't want to give you too much. I want you to be able to figure this out on your own, but you definitely want to close these spaces down here. Try to keep them as consistent as possible, not by measure, but by perception. Of course, they're not going to be identical, exactly the same, because we have curved letter forms and straight letter forms. We have serifs also. So the illusion is that they're identical. Okay, and that may not measure out to being measured as identical. Okay, I hope that makes sense. Okay, so those are my only recommendations. A few areas of kerning and then letter spacing. A couple of areas where you want to pay attention to your craft and make sure you draw those letters as accurately as possible based on your sketches. Okay. All right, great job. If you have any questions at all, Samuel, please let me know. Thank you very much.